Un abrazo fuerte.
A big hug to all the brothers and sisters.
Muchas gracias, hermanas.
Thank you, brothers and sisters.
Muchas gracias, hermana Neida.
Thank you, Sister Neida. You're welcome for your energies. And now I will present the agenda rapidly. So we will have opening words from Preston, and then from Talco from the CBD Secretariat, and then we will have the capacity building session on what DSI is, what are the different genetic resources, and we'll talk about the upcoming discussions at the COP16, and we will have a dialogue. Regarding the words of the co-chairs, I would like, on behalf of them, I would like to thank the DSI working group for all the work that it is doing and for organizing this workshop. And also, the co-chairs would like to thank all the participants. This is a priority topic at the COP16. This is why it's very important that we understand this topic so we can develop a position and contribute to the workshop on DSI that will have a meeting in August this year, and also at COP16. So with these words, now I will invite Preston to speak. Go ahead, Preston.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you all are here. Welcome, and thank you for deciding to take this training opportunity. It's a little more than just training. What I'm hoping we can come out of this is some unity and agreement on where we're going to go for COP16. I think that so far we are continuing on with the pathway that we've been following now for several years. Our positions really haven't changed much, but of course we're always open to listen. But we, as was mentioned, this is going to be one of the core topics for the upcoming COP, and the expectations are high. We need to see if we can come to unity around our positions, because as those who've been through this for a long time know, if you show disunity and discord, then others who are not supportive of us or against us can use that as a wedge issue to drive issues off the table. We also are going to need support by parties in order to get our positions moved at the end of the day. So we need to have some strong positions and need to get them solidified as soon as possible. The other thing, the reason we need to do it is we need to start shopping our positions. So once they are solidified, we can start approaching parties, both in the formal sessions, such as the informal advisory group and other meetings, the upcoming fourth meeting of the open-ended working group on DSI. But we're also having many informal meetings, and we have, of course, back channel discussions as parties approach us. We need to have discussions with our own national delegations. So we do need to solidify our positions as early as possible so we can move on and be as successful as possible. Now, today I'll be doing most of the talking. Unfortunately, I'm sorry about that, but that's how it worked out. Tomorrow we will have lots of presenters, and on Thursday we will also have a diversity of presenters. But I also am wanting to leave time for questions and answers and for dialogue so that we can have some good discussions over the issues being taken here. The first presenter, I'd like to introduce Dauko Chikongo from the Secretariat. Dauko will kind of bring us through where we're at in the negotiations and discussions now, what has to be done, and where we're headed towards up to COP16. After Tauco is done with his presentation, I will start on kind of again going through what I gave on Saturday. There's some more information, and I will go into it in more detail. And mainly today, what I want to do in my presentation is kind of illustrate why we need to shift thinking from genetic resources to digital sequence information. And remember, there is an existing decision, 15.9, to establish a global biodiversity benefit sharing mechanism. So that decision's already been made. But we need to understand kind of the underlying technical issues, why these approaches are being taken. And again, I apologize for the technical work. It's not all technical, but in this case, there is a large technical background and substrate that underlies the approach. So I invite Tauco to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Preston. Just getting my screen ready. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it's perfectly.
Still visible?
Yes, it's perfect.
Very good. Yeah, thank you, and good day to all of you, wherever you are, day, night, morning. As Preston said, I'm Tauco Congo, and I'm with the Secretariat. In terms of what I intend to do with you today within this capacity building workshop is to give you an overview of ABS within the convention and also within Nagoya Protocol, and then take a look at what is this thing called DSI and the process that has been undertaken through that. And for today, I'll go slightly up to COP15, the outcomes there, and then I may not go too much into the post-COP 15 issues that we will reserve for tomorrow and then conclude. In terms of the ABS under the convention, there one has to note that the fundamental principle is the principle of national sovereignty of state over their natural resources, which is captured in Article 2 of the convention. And that gives legal nature over biological resources, including genetic resources, to the states. And therefore, states have authority to determine access to their genetic resources as encapsulated in Article 15. And such access will happen then under two conditions: prior informed consent for the genetic resource and for the associated traditional knowledge, which then brings in Article 8J of the convention. And this happens on mutually agreed terms between the provider and the user. And that then provides a basis for achieving the third objective of the convention. Now, what we saw is that there were challenges within with achieving this third objective under the convention because of the parties focused mostly on work on the first two objectives, whereas the third one left behind. And so we saw more measures for conservation and use of biodiversity being put in place. And then in the attempts to rectify that, the bond guidelines were developed and approved. And then, but still, there were key concerns about misappropriation of resources. And there was a demand for an international regime on access and benefit sharing under the CBD, which took place in Johannesburg during the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And so this regime was then negotiated to provide greater legal certainty for users and providers. And it concluded with the Nagoya Protocol being adopted in Japan in 2010. And when we look at the Nagoya Protocol, one can ask the question, what has changed then from ABS under the convention to ABS under the Nagoya Protocol? We see that the Nagoya Protocol expands the obligations of the CBD on ABS in that it established an international access and benefit sharing system, and it detailed a roadmap of agreed principles and rules for access and utilization of not only the genetic resources, but also the associated traditional knowledge. And it provided users and providers of genetic resources and ATK greater clarity and certainty of what is permissible and what is not. And then it clarifies the legal policy and administrative measures that countries can take to with regard to conditions of access to genetic resources and ATK. And it also requires the commitment on tracking, monitoring of the utilization made of genetic resources and ATK by provider countries and by user countries, even when the latter chose not to regulate access to genetic resource and ATK. We also know that under the Nagoya Protocol, there were a number of outstanding issues, one of them being Article 10, which called for the establishment of a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism for transboundary cases in which PIC cannot be granted, as well as Article 4, Para 4, which focused on specialized international ABS instruments and looking at what could be the criteria for identification of such specialized instruments. Now, having said that, it brings us to this issue of DSI, which is the main focus of your discussions over the next couple of days. And this issue is an emerging aspect of synthetic biology, which involves certain functional genetic sequences being shared via different means. And it can thus be said that the DSI carries information just as do genes. But the term so far does not have an internationally agreed meaning. And it is recognized that it's not the only term out there that is being used. So the access to and transfer of these data to third parties for either commercial or non-commercial purposes can be done without a variety of restrictions and conditions, depending on the institutional framework, laws, and policies governing the provider. And so regulation of the use of DSI may have, therefore, implications for ABS frameworks. And that's where the point of controversy then came in regarding DSI. And this controversy was highlighted then in 2016 under the discussions of the synthetic biology in COP14, or actually in COP13. Now, the main point of divergence was on a number of things. It was on the scope, the definition and then on benefit sharing. Regarding the scope, parties could not agree whether DSI falls within the scope of the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, or whether it doesn't fall in that scope, because peak cannot be determined, although in some cases MAT can be determined. So that divergence then emerged, and the next one was on the definition. As you saw in the previous slide, there is no international agreed definition, and the divergence was around how the term could be defined and whether it should be defined, because defining this term will link it then to whether it falls within the scope of ABS, and whether and how benefits in that case should then be shared. And regulation will mean, therefore, that the term must be defined to see what is in the scope of that term and what is not. And that brings us then to the third divergence, which was on benefit sharing. Some felt that excluding DSI from the scope of regulation would undermine the third objective of the CBD, as well as the Nagoya Protocol objective of fair and equitable benefit sharing arising from the use of genetic resources and the associated traditional knowledge. Therefore, some also thought that access to DSI can be a substitute for access to tangible genetic resources. And without an agreement on benefit sharing from the commercial use of DSI, many countries may start to regulate all access to DSI, thus limiting non-commercial access and the benefits. And that may have an impact on non-monetary benefits currently provided by open access to DSI through genetic sequence repositories and the scientific research that comes out of it. So these issues were then considered, and a party-led process was established and put in place then for parties to find a way to discuss and come to an agreement on the scope, definition, and whether benefits should be shared. And this had to happen within the frame of the global values framework, which was then being discussed at that time. If we look at the scope, the process that was put in place has led to an ATEC, Ad hoc Technical Expert Group, and they had, amongst other things, the mandate to look at what could be the scope of DSI and how could that be defined. We saw that they came up after looking at the results they received, that there is 3 groups that were emerging there that could be considered as DSI. There is the group 1, that is DNA and RNA, group 2, DNA and RNA plus the proteins, and then group 3, DNA, RNA, proteins, and metabolites, as well as other micromolecules. Now, it was noted that within these groupings, there is the issue of associated information that also included the associated traditional knowledge, as well as the ecological interactions that must be taken into account. In terms of then looking at how to regulate DSI and whether to regulate DSI, this process came up with a number of DSI policy options. And you can see on the left hand that there is if you look at this table, there you can look at it from where access is not regulated or where access is regulated. If you don't regulate it, then there is no peak and there is no mud because there is no one to provide that. And if you're going to regulate it, then you need to have somebody that provides the prior informed consent, and in some cases, the mutually agreed terms. And then the juxtaposing that is whether this is happening within a bilateral mechanism of a clear provider and user, or whether it is a multilateral mechanism where it is not very clear as to who is providing such access. And can you track the country of origin as the case for a bilateral mechanism, or are you able to not track and trace the country of origin where that DSI came from? And then are you able to then link these to benefits sharing or not? Using those criteria or sort of archetypes to structure the thoughts, a number of options emerge. I won't go through all of them, but option 0 is to say, well, status quo remains and divergence remains regarding benefit sharing from the use of DSI, and there is no change in the system. We don't need to discuss this, and so we move on. Or we can integrate DSI fully into national ABS measures. What would that mean? And then there is the other ones where, if you look at option 5, no benefit sharing from DSI, which means there is also no international agreement with regard to benefit sharing from the use of DSI. And there was then the 6th option that there could be a 1% levy on retail sales of energy resources payment that could go into a multilateral mechanism where you then not require tracking and tracing of the country of origin, and where it is also not linked to any benefit sharing or it's decoupled from benefit sharing. Now, when you go through that table, it came to point that there were some issues that have to be noted, and that is that parties differ on whether definition of genetic resource includes DSI or not, as I've said, they have been saying before. And parties are, of course, free to take from that table and combine the different options that are there at national level. And bilateral sharing, if you go for that option, will mean that you need to be able to trace the DSI back to the country of origin, and therefore you may have to tag the DSI then in databases, and what are the implications of doing so, and in terms of cost and efficiency, etc. And multilateral approach will require that there needs to be a governance structure in place, and of course, some kind of system that could receive and distribute those benefits that comes into it to the beneficiaries. And there were also proposals to change existing practices in DSI databases, and these will depend on whether those databases and their users will adhere to those changes and whether there is a legal basis for doing so. And it also further compounded by, will the users of DSI be able to comply with some of these options? And that also may mean that it may have significant transaction costs between the agents that would want to interact in such transactions. And upfront cost or access fees could impact on innovation and research, and thus hindering the benefit of open science and innovation. So that is what went to COP15, and parties discussed it there, and what they then came to an agreement was that benefits from the use of digital sequence information genetic resources should be shared fairly and equitably. And they've also said, given the issues around it, there is need for a very distinctive solution for benefit sharing. And they've also recognized that tracking and tracing of all digital sequence information may not be practical, and that there is need for more depositing of DSI into databases as appropriate. Now, the decision continued, and here in para 9, they said if a solution is found, then there are these criteria that must be used to characterize that solution, whatever that mechanism would be. It must be efficient, it must be feasible, and it must be practical. And it should not hinder research and innovation. And which is of importance to you is that it must take into account the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, including with respect to the associated traditional knowledge regarding the genetic resources that they are custodians of. And paragraph 10 recognizes that if there are any benefits that arise from these from the use of digital sequence information, be it monetary or non-monetary, that these be used to support conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and that also indigenous people and local communities should be beneficiaries from such benefits that may arise. And they then agreed also that the approach to fair and equitable benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information, because this is happening within the CBD, it shouldn't affect existing rights and obligations under the convention and the Nagoya Protocol, including, as applicable, also those rights and obligations that currently apply to traditional community, to traditional knowledge, and the rights of IPLCs, and that it is without prejudice to what happens at national level regarding national access and benefit sharing measures of the respective parties to the Nagoya Protocol or to the convention. And having said all of that, in terms of then operationalizing their decision that benefits be shared, they put in place they will establish a multilateral mechanism, and that multilateral mechanism will include a global fund into which benefits should be then deposited. And they decided to establish a fair, transparent, inclusive, participatory, and time-bound process to develop and operationalize the multilateral mechanism, and then also develop, establish, and operationalize the global fund that is linked to the mechanism. And so, because this is time-bound, they have put in place a couple of actions that must happen and that must lead up to COP16. And so first, they said there is the parties must submit views of on a number of issues that they have decided needs further consideration with regard to the mechanism and with regard to the fund, such as where should this fund be hosted, how will it be governed, what could be the triggering points for benefit sharing, etc. And then also they wanted to learn from the lessons that other such funds or mechanisms have experienced. And then they've also asked for studies to look at what could be the value chain revenue points alongside the value chain of the business of DSI, and then also modeling of policy options vis-a-vis those criteria that has been identified. And all of this work has to be done by COP 16. Now, you'll find that, as I've said before, this is happening within the frame of the Kunming-Montreal Global Policy Framework. So there is decisions on capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation, and technology transfer. There is resources, resource mobilization that is needed. And so some of the decisions, to establish the multilateral mechanism, including a global fund, there is also a special trust fund that was established for the Global Policy Framework Fund. And there was an advisory committee on resource mobilization that was established that this also has relevance to DSI. And then there's the issue of contributions governance of the DSI fund. Then there is monitoring evaluation, because unless we can establish know where we've come from, we may not know where we are going and whether we have arrived. And so this solution should be effective, and there therefore must be a monitoring and evaluation and review of the effectiveness of this fund and its mechanism. And as I've said before, there is the issues that relates to Article 8J under Peoples and Biodiversity, and it recognizes that benefits should be used to benefit IPLCs and their roles and rights and interests of IPLCs, including their decay. So I'll stop there, and then I'll hand over to Preston, and I'm sure he will then go into the technical aspects of DSI and may repeat some of what I've said. And hopefully these two presentations together will give you an understanding or a deeper overview of the insights, interests, and perspectives that are out there, and how that then can lead you towards developing your own position amidst the positions of the others, in view that in COP16, you will have to find the necessary win-win between your position, interest, and view, and that of the other stakeholders around you at the table. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity for having invited the Secretariat to present to you at this capacity building workshop. And this presentation, of course, has been prepared in partnership with all the staff here at the Secretariat. Thank you very much. Over to you, Preston.
Yeah, first I would like to open up if there are any questions from Tauco or Tauco.
Like there are no questions, it means I must have been very boring and not very clear.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's in terms of the inclusion of IPs, LCs in monitoring and evaluation. Is there any details on any considerations regarding that? Assessment, evaluation, monitoring with the inclusion, on traditional knowledge indicators and biocultural indicators.
Is there any other question? And I can take them in one go. If
Yeah,
not,
hi,
I will proceed.
Yeah, hi, it's John. I was just listening to what Tauco you were just saying there, and I just wondered, there's some things rolling around in my brain around in terms of the benefit sharing and the benefits in terms of us here in Australia, and particularly in my state, because some of the things that are actually covered in there, which hasn't come into the conversation. Yes, oh, well, it may have come into the conversation, mate, sorry, and you could probably tell me, has there been discussion around where if DSI is used to genetically modify a species, because the Act, it covers things in terms of things like discovery of new species and increased taxonomic information, but also it looks at, I think 1.3.7, it looks at advancing scientific knowledge and the development of new species. So what if DSI is used to genetically modify and creates a new species? How is that then framed in terms of what's known as, both state, whether it's, the national or the state government, jurisdictional, their qualified ownership in terms of those species and the way that they regulate those species in terms of proprietary rights. So there's a space there. Has there, well, I think in short, has there been conversation in terms of the way that DSI may be used in terms of advancing scientific knowledge and the development of new species? And therefore, how does then that relate? So even at a global scale, and I spoke about this the other day in terms of what we did with our DSI group, is that we have flyways. So if a particular bird species is genetically modified, but it comes from, like the waders that come from up around Polina's area in Russia, Siberia, around that space, all the way to Australia, but they drop into different nation states on the way through. So we've got qualified ownership in terms of those species. And as Preston points out, it's a key point that species do move in and out, but that's what that qualified ownership, there are structures, customary structures for that. So I think simply would be, has there been discussion about that process of DSI being used to genetically modify a species and creating new species? Has that been a conversation? And how that may relate to Indigenous peoples' property rights?
Thank you. Let me take those two, and then I'll continue others. And I'll take the last question. What I hear you ask is the following: has the discussion advanced to the extent that the solution can be future-proofing in the event that DSI technologies are used in ways that we cannot foresee right now?
Very good, Telco. Yes.
I went to this timeline for the studies, or for the process, and you will see there that there is that is asking for value chain and revenue points. That study may have some answers to what you are asking, in that there may be some scoping of what could be the future areas into which this will diverge, so that there can be some measure of future proving, not only in relation to what you've asked, but there is also the increase in the capacities and abilities and skills of artificial intelligence and what they may mean for systems and issues that we have at current. And as you were speaking, what comes to mind is that it's a global fund, it's a global mechanism, and from what you were saying, there were elements of bilateralism there. There were also elements of tracking and tracing coming to the fore, because how will you know what DSI was used, from which database, or what section was used to engineer that particular bird species? And because you don't know that, maybe the fund and the mechanism is what is needed. So that is a shooting from the hip, but that is being considered there. I hope that helps you. There has been some talks of AI, and the word future proofing has come out in the discussions. And of course, you are free to further explore that in the way you have phrased your question. What is it that you can bring to the table for the others at the table to consider? And I'll move to the next question, which had to do with monitoring and evaluation. And here there is a number of things to consider. There is the monitoring of benefits that have gone into the funds, if there is a fund, and that then will be dispersed. And because under the target 13 and goal C, there is a clear instruction that benefits sharing must increase. And for that to be done, and there's a certain time frame for that. For it to be done, there must be monitoring and evaluation. And but there is, in this case, we're looking at monitoring, evaluation, and review of the effectiveness of the solution. Those are two different things. And again, in your discussions, you may want to tease out exactly what do you see as important for monitoring evaluation. There is the mechanism, there is the fund, and there is, of course, also the hosting of the mechanism in the fund. And all of those things have implications on the effectiveness of that. And then there is the monitoring of the indicators to show you whether benefits have increased from the baseline when this fund has come in. So there's a whole lot of things that has to be done. Some of them at the national level, because as part of the NBSUP review process, countries are asked to set their national targets. But all of that, as of now, I don't think has taken into DSI into account, because there is not yet a operational solution. And so those are the things that have to be considered by the parties within the context of operationalizing and finding a solution to this issue of DSI within the limits of the decisions that came out of the COP. That's the long answer to your question. Thank you. Any other question? Daniel?
Yes. Thank you, Taukonjo. I just have a question here. What the convention, is there any clause in the convention that put a safeguard or a grievance addressing mechanism when something goes wrong? I'm following up on the question of John earlier on. What will happen if there's any abuse of rights and so on? And I know that we have capacity building and scientific cooperation between the parties. What will happen then if any of the parties or any of the scientific body come to abuse the rights of DSI, especially for indigenous people and local communities, about their traditional knowledge or the use of the resources? Is there any grievance mechanism or how to address that? Thank you.
Thank you. You'll see I put up the slide on issues that has to be noted, that with regard to the policy options that have been proposed to be considered, but actually which is now at that time, that issue was discussed, and how do you ensure compliance by users of DSI? And it was said that some of the options that were on the table would be very difficult. So, and I guess when you, and that has an implication on the nature of the solution. Is the solution a legally binding instrument negotiated? Is the solution is it a contractual solution, or is the solution a decision by the conference of the parties? That answer will give an answer to you in terms of ensuring compliance and remedial actions and sanctions and all of that, if necessary. So that is part of your work, to decide and see what makes sense for you, keeping in mind that there are these issues about that give the parameter or the criteria or the characteristics of the fund or the mechanism, that it must be efficient, feasible, practical, it mustn't hinder research, it must be effective, and provide certain legal clarity for provider users. All of those things have been agreed upon and must be met. And so it is then for you to now see the question you've asked, does it fall within that, and what is the best way to address it? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
John?
Yep. Now looking at, I take note of John Locke's question around the results of this, perhaps of some unintended consequences as one end of the spectrum. And that certainly needs to be put into the process of the framework, because we are looking at intended consequences to address biodiversity loss and so forth. That's important. It's not just a mere reaction of getting onto DSI and so forth. So we have to give it a rationale for those things. But on the other end of that, for the indigenous peoples and the local communities on the front end, I think it's also important that their role, especially with respect to rights and FPIC, there needs to be a process for indigenous peoples and local communities to ensure that what they're doing about their own traditional knowledge will be a process that they will certainly be in control of, and they'll decide based on FPIC if they want to go forward with something or not. That's an important part of the process. I certainly am looking at your points here listed on number 9, especially when it says be efficient, feasible, practical, not hinder research and so forth. Is that and letter I, take into account the rights, is that there needs to be a process at the front end that doesn't preclude that indigenous peoples need to send their TK or that knowledge into the process at the cost of their own protection. So that the process itself is based on indigenous people's decisions, based on their communities and so forth, and that they have a right to make those decisions as they see fit. So they may not go forward with certain actions because of the protections that they want to continue to have on their knowledge and the associated genetic resources. So I think that needs to be ensured as well, even that in terms of capacity building at that level, at the community level. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether that was a question or a statement, but I'll rephrase what I heard you say. You said the following, that the solution to DSI, whichever way it is developed, the mechanism, the DSI fund should ensure that it take into account the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, including with respect to the traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources that they hold. And then you also point out that you see that the parties to the convention also said that this solution or approach should not affect existing rights and obligations under the convention and the Nagoya Protocol. When I spoke before about the CBD, I mentioned Article AJ, and also that Nagoya Protocol takes some of that further, including as applicable those related to traditional knowledge and the rights of indigenous people and local communities without prejudice to national action and benefit sharing measures. So what those things are saying is that in this meeting, in your capacity building workshop, you need to look at what is it that you would like this approach to do to safeguard what you say, taking into account the criteria of the solution, so that what you are going to ask doesn't stifle research, does not do this, does not do that, does not do that, and respond to the characteristics that has been set by the parties. And I think that is then the purpose of this capacity building workshop. And also listening to you, and I think Preston would go further into that, we have to have a very clear distinction of DSI and its link to ATK and genetic resources. Because the way the solution has gone so far is to leave that alone and to say, let's benefit be shared, let's find a solution of how to do that efficiently, effectively, and all of that. So we thus have to be careful then that we remain within that frame of it's the approach to fair and equitable benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information on genetic resources and associated TK. I'll stop there. Thank you. And I believe, Preston, that was the last question that I had. So
Okay.
I thank all those that have asked us the questions. Thank you so much. And may you have a very good workshop further.
Thank you very much, Tauco, for the presentation. It was really good. And I think there were some people wondering if that could be made available to the participants or.
Surely I can, it should be possible to forward it to you for distribution. Thank you so much.
All righty, thank you.
I'm stopping to share now.
Okay.
I'll give you your platform back.
So what I propose now is that we take a brief break, maybe 5 minutes. Would that be okay to the co-chairs or the?
Yeah.
Okay, and then we resume and then we'll just shoot on through to the end. Okay. So
We'll come back.
at 5 by 5 after, we'll give you 7 minutes. Okay, is that?
Okay.
Okay.
We'll come back in 7 minutes because we have 1 hour more, no? It's 2
Yeah,
hours.
that's right. So
Yes.
I
So
want to leave
please
time for
keep-
questions.
Because now Preston will be explaining us what is DSI and what is important for us and which is the role of traditional knowledge. Thank you, Preston. So we back in 5 minutes, but maybe because we don't have all the information, maybe it will be good if you didn't put your names on the chat. Please do it. The name and organization. So, and yeah, and maybe Olga, if you could like stop the recording as we will come back in 5 minutes. Sí. Adelante, Preston.
Okay. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, so let's begin. It's a packed agenda. First of all, I want to say that the items here have been worked on for a long time, for over 5 years by the IIFB working group on DSI. Here's a few of the names. I don't have them all. These are some of the people who've consistently contributed, but again, I don't want to leave anybody out. And if you want to write me and let me know that you'd like your name reflected on this list, I'm happy to put it on. But just to let everybody know, this has been a group effort. I won't cover a lot of this. If you were in our meeting on Saturday, you'll recognize a lot of these slides. As a matter of fact, you'll recognize a lot of them from previous presentations. I've added a few more, but I think again, we need to continually go back over these because DSI is a new beast. As Tauco said, it's a new item on the agenda. Digital sequence information is not equivalent to genetic resources. It has its own characteristics. The way I tend to express it, it's kind of like saying if you can't apply Newtonian physics to all of the world. There are other aspects of the world at the very, very small and at the very, very large where they have their own explanations and principles and so on. So when you go to digital sequence information, it's like going from Newtonian mechanics that explains how, when you fire a missile, how the missile will travel, to something called quantum mechanics. Well, that's why we need to go into the technical details, because we're now at the more quantum mechanics stage of understanding genetics. And again, as Tauco said, the addition of genetic resources at the CBD was based on the principle of national sovereignty over wealth and resources. Genetic resources were brought into the fold. In 1953, the genetic structure of DNA was discovered. And part of the impetus of all of this is that the research started to take off, has gotten faster and faster, and keeps on accelerating. At the time of the negotiation of the convention, there were state concerns over biopiracy. There's indigenous peoples and local community concerns. States were mostly concerned about lack of benefit sharing. We know from indigenous peoples and local community points of view, there were also values, spiritual values and cultural values involved. And so that kind of got this issue onto the table. And also the CBD was introduced this idea of benefit sharing for access to and the use of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. It's quite an innovation. Now, again, as I said on Saturday, genetic resources actually has a definition. It's defined as material of actual or potential value. So it's not really anything specific about the structure. And that it's any material of plant, animals, microbial, or others containing functional units of heredity. And again, this definition does not touch on the structure of genetic information, of genetic sequences. It only talks about a sample containing functional units of heredity. Utilization is mentioned, but it is not defined within the CBD. Nagoya Protocol defined it in Article 2 as the conduct of research and development on genetic or biochemical composition of genetic resources, including through the application of biotechnology, as defined in the convention. So here's a picture that kind of explains where the concerns are coming from. Again, there was a specific model. It was about people coming onto indigenous people's lands or local communities' lands and taking genetic resources or acquiring indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, either from their lands, novel, unrevealed knowledge, or using knowledge that had already been revealed and was in publications and textbooks and so on. There were many issues that they had. First of all, the indigenous peoples and local communities tended to talk about relationships and values and stewardship and custodianship and guardianship over animals and plants. Non-indigenous peoples tend to refer to these as resources. So there was kind of a language barrier. But again, it was about biological samples being required, taken to institutions like seeds and potatoes and other things, germplasm, being used for non-commercial research and commercial research, and that people were making money off of these things, where as indigenous peoples over on the right is a symbol that looked at these as spiritual and relational issues. The way of conceiving traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources was that traditional knowledge is something that's applied to from the outside that provides a useful guide to discovering traits that might be associated with genetic structure. Whereas all the technology and the really hard work was done by those outside, whereas indigenous peoples and local communities could provide useful leads, which itself is a really problematic understanding. So as Tauco said, they needed a more of a framework than was supplied in the initial convention to implement all of their declarations on indigenous peoples and local communities' rights to traditional knowledge and to national sovereignty over genetic resources. So here are some of the roots of that. I won't go into them in detail. I will just point out that, first of all, we did try a Nagoya Protocol very hard for 10 years to get the recognition of the indigenous peoples and local communities' rights to genetic resources. As I've said many times before, you need to look at Decision 6, Article 6 out of the Nagoya Protocol that details what the decision is, and the decision is indigenous peoples and local communities have those rights when those rights are recognized by the states, but they don't have them in terms of the international framework. It's just not something that's given. The other thing to realize is that we have to have voluntary frameworks. Only there are 141 ratifications at this point. That's a very large number, including the European Union. But many countries, 57 currently, are not ratifiers of that convention. There are also genetic resources that were collected prior to 1994 and genetic resources collected prior to 2014. And those are the dates on the years on which the Nagoya Protocol and the convention came into force. And so there are genetic resources that are just off the table. They're considered as not legally regulated. And of course, anybody can do research and extract, in a legal sense, can extract information from those. But again, you might consider this, even though voluntary frameworks have their weaknesses, they also can allow for side agreements to be made. For example, corporate social responsibility type agreements that could go farther than the lowest common denominator of international legal frameworks. Okay, so Nagoya Protocol set up, as Tauco also said, a bilateral contractual regime. The power of this regime says that nobody can come on to national sovereign territories and take genetic resources. Nobody can come on to any indigenous people's territories or even out of their territories or local community areas, use their traditional knowledge without prior informed consent. And again, I'm just using the phrase in the Nagoya Protocol. So the Nagoya Protocol does recognize the rights to prior informed consent over traditional knowledge. and that's settled. Treaties also only apply to those countries that have ratified them. It's good to bring them up to remind those parties that have ratified them that they are bound, but those parties are non-parties that aren't members, they're not bound. We think the same applies to indigenous peoples with the right of self-determination. For example, the question of, can states adopt treaties on your behalf without your accession to them? But that's not been well adjudicated or adopted by states, and we're not going to be able to really, I think, make any progress on it soon until there's been some groundwork on that. Contracts allow you to what's called contract into custom. It gives you tight control over the use of any genetic resources you decide to share or any traditional knowledge that you decide to be used. And again, this little Article 6 boldface is just a reminder. Article 6 really says that where they have that right within the nation state, they have the right to grant access to genetic resources. Well, in that same Nagoya Protocol, Article 10 identified a problem, a transboundary problem. And again, they were really thinking in terms of migratory species such as salmon, migratory birds, and so on, where things swim, whole bodies swim across borders. And of course, once a salmon goes from, say, Washington State into Canadian waters, it then becomes a part of Canada's decision. You know, it's up to them to make decisions about that resource. And so that was a real problem. They said these kinds of situations, also where indigenous peoples might share traditional knowledge between national borders, and it's not easy or difficult to make decisions, then maybe there should be a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism. So that's where in 2010, where the multilateral mechanism came on, and it actually was never discussed. It came up in the third to last day of the negotiations at COP and got put in by the COP president. So that has a very interesting history. Okay. Now, digital sequence information is a different beast. It adds to any complexity and challenges of the ABS and Nagoya Protocol model. ABS and Nagoya Protocol don't deal with technical issues at the genomic level, at the level of the chromosome or gene sequence. The legal treatment of biological samples is pretty straightforward. If somebody collects a sample from your land, it doesn't matter how widely the genes in that sample are shared. It doesn't matter who else has access wherever. Because that sample comes from your territory or your sovereign land, then it is up to you to make the decisions over what happens to that sample. So anything taken, you know, any genetic resource taken from indigenous people's lands really should require their free prior informed consent. And for local communities, prior informed consent, or whatever phraseology we come up with. The problem is that these resources move, and I will get to that in a second. And so they're not confined. Those sequences are not confined to your lands. And what happens when they move off to your lands, and what happens when they move onto your lands. Okay, again, it's easy to divide bodies like fish. That's not so much of a problem. And it's also easy to deal with samples that are taken from indigenous peoples or local communities' lands, waters, and territories. That's not a problem. Where there's a problem is in the nature of the genome. Once you drop down to that quantum mechanic kind of level, the level of the genes themselves, of the gene sequences, the first problem you run into is that most genes are shared widely, both within a species, and they're shared widely among species. So I'm using the human being as an example. Human beings aren't included in the convention, but just it makes it easier. I have these figures readily available. We're 99% chimpanzee, so that means 99% of our genes are exactly the same ones found in chimpanzees. So if we tried to claim sovereignty over all the genes within our bodies, we would also be claiming sovereignty over chimpanzee genes. And the same is with bears. 80% of our genes are exactly like those in bears, 60% exactly like those in salmon, 40% like insects, and 1/4 of our genes essentially are shared with wine grapes. So when you're drinking your next glass of wine, say hello to your relative. So that means that, first of all, defining what is actually unique and what is uniquely yours, what could be counted as something that only occurs on your lands, waters, and territories, is difficult because of this shared genetic background that all species share. Okay, so you really have to identify those unique genes that are distinctly on your territories. The problem there is that these unique genes are really a very small part of the genome. In terms of nucleotides, nucleotide is essentially, I'll show you a picture of nucleotide in the next slide. But there are huge numbers within a vertebrate genome, like your genomes. There's 6 billion nucleotides. 6 billion small, tiny bits of information about genetic information. In terms of number of genes, there's 20,000 to 30,000. But remember, the vast majority of those are shared between species and within your own species. Very few of them, in fact, are unique in any one place. And so every species you go to, you can see it's the same bit. And again, this slide will be made available. You can go and look up these terms and figure out what the technical meaning of them. So again, shared within a species, most genes, very small number. And of course, those are valuable. Researchers are seeking access to those. Within a genus, which is, different kinds of robins. They're all robins, but there are many species of robins, and so they still share many of their genes and so on. And this is just a pic, reflecting what I showed you before. Okay. Now, what is the structure of genes? Actually, it's very simple. There's only 4 base pairs of nucleotides, and those base pairs actually only, each one of those kinds of base pairs, there's their technical names, I won't belabor that, you can see it. Each one of those base pairs only with one of the other base pairs. So A always pairs with adenine, pairs with thymine, cytosine pairs with guanine. What that means is that actually that's all of life is just an endless sequences of patterns of these 2 pairs. And that creates this whole giant diversity of life. But what it also means is that at its basic level, the structure of being able to sort out what belongs to whom isn't, it's based on a very simple code, actually. So that's the first thing to recognize. Okay, and so if you, as I said on Saturday, if you actually look at what is unique, it is usually a very small number of novel mutations. It could even be a single mutation that distinguishes between one species and another. So usually these are just a handful of mutations. So that's another barrier. The other problem is, how do you identify even that as being your property? Because again, as I will show you in a second, species move in and out of territories. At the same time, we have the rise of many different kinds of genetic research, synthetic biology, which has its own discussion area, thematic area within the CBD, something called omics, there are, you're used to genetics and by now probably, but there's also the study of molecules, the studies of genetic sequences and their interactions with the environment. There's the rise of a new kind of technology called CRISPR, which allows for genetic manipulation. There was another one, which was polymerase chain reaction, PCR, which is an earlier one. I don't have it on the slide. What that does is allow you to take very small bits of DNA, which are very hard to study, and amplify them so you make huge numbers of copies, and then you can start doing chemical and other kinds of analysis on them. When the human genome was first mapped, it took hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a 10-year massive effort that spanned the whole world. You can now go and get whole genome analysis. It's actually not as extensive as, say, the human genome analysis, but it will look across. You can submit copies of your own personal genome to these companies, and they will look for genetic anomalies that represent diseases and traits and so on. So, and it costs usually around $99. So the technology's gotten really cheap. It's really widespread, and it is almost impossible to control. Then, of course, we have artificial intelligence. We have big data, something called in silico, which is essentially digital sequencing research. And we have other issues arising, like out of the World Health Organization, with virus sharing and ability to tackle pandemics, as we just discovered. With the FAO International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, they needed to develop some properties and so on DSI and so on. And I want to go back here very quickly just to remind you what DSI is. Here you have a physical resource, this double-stranded physical thing called deoxyribonucleic acid. And as I said, it's made up of these 4 base pairs. Well, once you've discovered what that base pair is, what you do is for adenine, you just assign the letter A. For thymine, you assign the letter T. For cytosine, C. What you then have is a list of A, TT, CC, GGA, whatever the sequence is, but you don't actually have to have, once you have that, you just use these 4 simple letter codes. Once you have that, you actually know the exact structure of that physical genome. And okay, so mute my microphone. Okay, maybe you muted somebody else. Okay, so the point is, once you have that sequence of letters, you don't really need access to the genome anymore. What you're doing in all of this digital sequence manipulation by artificial intelligence is they're manipulating these letters. That's all they're doing. And they're doing their analysis based on the letters. So they don't have direct access. They don't need direct access to the genome. And from that, they can actually reverse engineer the physical sequences using technology to recreate those sequences. So it's an issue. And again, there's a big question, is this even within the convention? They decided it was, but it needed a different kind of treatment than genetic resources. Won't go into this in detail. We don't have the time. But again, just there's a lot of different omics. And there are these interactions between genes of different species. They don't necessarily get reflected in the genome. Sometimes they do. But like in the Three Sisters indigenous cultivation system, it's not simply the genes in the corn plant that makes for maize productivity. It also has to do with microbes that live on the leaves and in the roots and on the stems, and other kinds of interactions, the mycorrhiza or the fungi that live in the soil, they all contribute to the production of the corn. So it's not simply in a single genome. It's information shared among species, and disentangling that is also kind of a nightmare. Again, I want to reemphasize there's natural forms of gene migration and recombination. The first centered on the taking of samples, misappropriation of genetic resources or genetic samples from lands, waters, and territories. But the problem is all of these genes move on their own, and there are many ways in which they move. Also, movement occurs in every direction. Remember, even if we do support UNDRIP, we understand the sovereignty of indigenous peoples, for example, over their lands, waters, and territories. The problem is also, though, that genes move onto their territories from other sovereigns' territories. If there is to be a claim of a right once genes leave territories, then there's also a risk that states can start asserting their sovereign rights to genes that move onto your territories. And again, the problem is sorting out and finding the evidence that says this particular gene sequence occurs uniquely and only on my lands. So it is definitely under my sovereign jurisdiction. Even if it originates on indigenous people's lands, most genes very quickly will move off of those lands through some form of gene movement transfer. Also in the technology, genetic analysis, the old model was in an access and benefit sharing agreement. I negotiate with you, the researcher, with you, the corporation. You take my sample and you work only on my sample. And we work out what the benefits are going to be and what the restrictions are. The problem is that's not how research works now. In order to understand the functions of genes, you need to do a lot of comparison among gene sequences within a species. So many samples from individuals from the species from lots of places. You need to also look at the gene samples from multiple species. And trying to figure out what the function of a gene, ones that actually have some effect, is very difficult. Now, remember I told you that there are very few genes that are actually unique. Even if they're unique, it still doesn't prove that it has a function, that it has an effect, because there's lots of genes that they either don't know the function, that doesn't mean they don't have one, but they don't know them. So kind of really showing that there's a gene that somebody could derive a benefit from or is deriving a benefit from. You're not going to really know that until you've actually done digital sequence analysis, and it's not based on single analysis of single samples. As I said before, you also have the problem that there's also trillions of small gene sequences already out there. This system has been running, these databases have been up for over 25, 30 years, many of them. And that means a huge number that have not been regulated, and we're not going to be able to, certainly not before December, and I don't see really many pathways where we would get state support for clawing those back into ownership. So a large proportion of those genes are already out there. And as I said, just saying, hey, I now analyzed genes on my lands, and here's all the genes on my land, so I own all those. It's just, that's not going to establish an ownership claim. And you're also, with all of these billions of potential, tens of thousands of genes and billions of sequences, it's just going to lead to thickets of jurisdictional conflicts. I'm not saying you can't do it, but in order to do it, we need a better model than just kind of waving your hands in a general direction of a right. You really need to show what you can claim, how it's claimed, what it would cost, what the feasibility of it is, and all of those things. And I have yet to see a study that does that. Again, things migrate. You cannot stop that. And so that's what that, and again, they move through time and space. There's some that occurred in your ancestral domain. Again, there aren't, I don't know of many jurisdictions. We will hear about Queensland tomorrow. I think Queensland does pay attention to ancestral domain. There may be others. I would love to hear case studies that where others have considered rights in ancestral domain. But the problem is that lands have been, ceded, stolen, or otherwise occupied, and the existing legal regimes do not recognize sovereign jurisdiction over digital sequences or genetic resources on those ceded, stolen, or otherwise occupied lands, waters, and territories. Different states treat these ancestral domains differently. There are a few ones, and again, I'm hoping we have some good examples tomorrow, but if you have ones you want to bring tomorrow, please bring them. So again, our ability to negotiate a tight regime, and this goes to John Chichu's question on prior informed consent or free prior informed consent, it's not there yet. And again, we're going to have to figure out a kind of longer term strategy if we want to go that direction, but it's very difficult. Finally, in terms of intellectual property, you have to understand where we are on the intellectual property system, the Western one. Currently at WIPO, it does not, we're going to our final negotiation on a potential treaty, and we don't even know if it's going to be a treaty yet. It could just be a declaration, could be guidelines, we don't know. But even if it becomes a treaty, at best right now, it is what's called a transparency treaty, which helps to increase the transparency of where genetic resources come from. There are very few penalties or legal sanctions unless there is willful misappropriation and willful misuse of traditional knowledge or genetic sources. But in general, it is a very weak instrument, but we tried very hard, but we could never move a few number of countries. We did have our supporters, but we have another shot, but we only have 2 weeks. So it's going to be a tough fight. We have the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. You should read Goal C. It's very good. It says there shall be fair and equitable benefit sharing. It says ensuring traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources is appropriately protected. So that does reaffirm. So again, on traditional knowledge, we have multiple instruments that consistently say you have rights to your traditional knowledge. And though that's not going to go away. Decision 959, as Dalco pointed out, has many, many elements. So I've gone through this many times. I won't belabor it. We're going to cover all the elements tomorrow, or most of them, and we'll get to the final one on Thursday. We've advocated for the hybrid approach, of course, as the decision says. The decision is a hybrid, actually supports the hybrid approach, depending on your conception of it. But it says Nagoya exists and you shall respect Nagoya. CBD exists, you shall respect CBD. The difficulty we have is how do you get from CBD to these digital sequences? Now, we've been consistent. The IIFB has always said no sample should be digitized and deposited, that is a genetic resource sample taken from indigenous peoples or local communities, lands, waters, and territories. None should be deposited in this database unless they have prior informed consent, free prior informed consent, or approval and involvement. However, We're also aware once they go into those databases, we will not be able to have continued free, prior, and informed consent for every single decision made about those, that the rules will be different. So putting those, allowing your genetic resources taken from your territories to be deposited in one of this has consequences. Because we cannot have, if we start getting into a pick and mat regime, it will just be impossible to disentangle these conflicting property rights claims. And it will contradict the decision that these should not, affect research, should not be a barrier to research. What we have proposed, and we will discuss these tomorrow, is that there be something substituted for pick and mat once they enter into the database. So we got put into the parking lot of the decision. It wasn't part of the decision. It's still open up in the air. But in the parking lot is something called principles for data governance. And we've said, well, there need to be some data governance principles that will include participation by Indigenous peoples and local communities, that will include, making sure that the research is ethical and equitable. The decision's already been made that there has to be benefit sharing, but we do need some kind of language. And again, I would not get super ambitious about this, highly ambitious, because if we try to turn this into another pick and mat, we will not succeed. We do not have the support. We're not even near the support. We have the issue of raising funds. How are they raised? Are they raised from researchers? Are they raised from commercial sales? Are we going to allow voluntary contributions? That's still up in the air, and those discussions have yet to occur. Then we have the multilateral benefit sharing mechanism itself. This is what we will discuss on Thursday. And the discussion of non-monetary benefits. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that under Nagoya, we didn't really talk about non-monetary and monetary because there was a list, we talked about it, and there was a giant list of non-monetary benefits. But essentially, as a bilateral contract, it's up to you, whoever's making that contract, so say an Indigenous peoples and a researcher. It's up to them to determine what the benefits are, and those could be monetary. And the benefits are, it's encouraged that they comply, there's something to do with biodiversity, but they don't have to be. They can actually, they're decoupled from the convention. What's being proposed now, though, is a mechanism that does a lot more coupling. So these monetary benefits are never paid, there may be payouts. We have heard there are parties that want monetary benefits. But our suggestion is that no, they should be almost all or all in terms of projects. And the project should be directly related to something that benefits the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. Now, that could be a very wide number of things, and we'll be discussing that in our next working group meeting. We'll discuss it in the next meeting of the informal advisory group. I won't go into the timeline. Tauco had a nicer version of this. And also, I won't go into this because Tauco covered this, but and this will be available, and you can see what we've covered so far and what we still will be talking within the informal advisory group. My final thoughts, and then give you 15 minutes to do. TK is external to DSI. That's the decision. We didn't get embodied TK. We tried multiple times over several years. It did not fly. The use of traditional knowledge is protected by multiple instruments. That's also not something, we can complain about whether it's being effectively protected, and we can talk about mechanisms to monitor that within this benefit sharing mechanism, but it's really not a debatable issue because multiple decisions have already been made by the COP that protect that The remedy for using digital sequence information derived from GRs without FPIC or prior or approval and involvement. This is a little more complicated, but as I said, your rights are for your samples, not the genes themselves. If you had a problem with your sample being used, the remedy would likely be just the removal of that sample from the databases. But it would not lead to broad claims of rights over particular gene sequences. And again, if we're going to claim rights over particular gene sequences, we need a much better story with good legal foundation, exactly how that's going to work. And I have not seen one. And again, we're talking about biodiversity here. FAO has more scope for that than wild biodiversity, but still there are many, many problems within the FAO. Remember, very few plants are actually on their list of covered species. The broad scale benefit sharing mechanisms could provide substantial benefits and cut through all these complexities and provide benefits for something where no benefits are being shared or have been shared. And these could actually be in the billions of dollars per year could be generated through this fund. We will not resolve these complexities before COP16, and that's when the decision will be made. There is a risk of undermining the rights to control GRs that have come directly from indigenous peoples territories, but remember even these genetic resource rights that are codified for indigenous peoples, codified in UNDRIP, not codified for local communities at this point, are not recognized by the legal regimes at this point. Again, go to the Nagoya Article 6. There's a tension between this desire for tight control over access to and use of GRs. First, because indigenous peoples, local communities may want targeted benefit sharing, but also because of these cultural values. The decision is being made before there's a lot of strong experience and strong evidence. And so, of course, our worst position would if we, say, well, we're going to let this go forward, and then it turns out that this billions of dollars of money that I suggested evaporates and never materializes. Many governments are supporting substantial benefit sharing, targeted IPs and LCs, and conservation and sustainable use on the ground. So that's another very big benefit. And finally, I think we need to be careful about always framing this in terms as a biopiracy or those evil corporations kind of issue. It's a mixed bag. Actually, a very large number of uses of DSI are beneficial. And right now they're not doing, reverse engineering. And of course, we need to keep an eye on where they do, which is why we are focusing on principles of data governance. But framing it just simply as biopiracy is, ignoring the many, many benefits. And also, if indigenous peoples and local communities start getting in the way of research that, say, for Alzheimer's disease therapies or dementia or cancer or any of these other many, many benefits that people get, we will start to lose. We will start to be viewed as the bad actors in the room that are trying to stop the benefits. So of course, what we want to do is make sure that these good uses go forward, but also have safeguards against really bad uses. And that's the end of my presentation. And let's have discussions over 10 minutes. And we will have more discussion time over the next couple of days.
Muchas gracias, Preston. Tal vez podríamos ver algunas
Thank you
preguntas.
so much, Preston. Maybe now we can go to the round of questions, Q&A. Other questions regarding the presentations, Brian?
Hi, Preston, and hi, everyone. Just thank you so much for this great presentation. Every time I tune into one of these conversations, I learn more and more about the topic. And specifically to the last point that you made, I think it's important because yes, the narrative around it is mostly being framed negatively. And as you say, there are many, many benefits to this. And so maybe it would be good to also highlight some of those benefits if possible at some point during the presentation, and maybe some of the bad actors also that are having a direct impact on indigenous peoples. Some of those examples I think would help us have a clearer picture about how to frame this, and especially when it also comes to indigenous organizations like mine who are trying to communicate this message to the wider indigenous public about how this should be understood and more in lay terms, and that's what I'm here for. And thank you so much again, and maybe if you could share some of those examples, I would be very interested in writing a piece about that. Thank you.
Let's have Preston 3 questions, and after you respond, we don't have too much time. Mohammed?
¿Escúchame?
Sí, adelante, Mohammed.
Okay.
Yes, please. Thank you so much, Viviana. Thank you, Preston, for this presentation. Very interesting presentation. My question is how we can protect traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples in conditions that are not recognized. Thank you.
Gracias, Mohammed. Reinaldo?
Sí,
Reinaldo?
Preston, I would like to ask you about your comments on the decision about traditional knowledge is external to DSI. If you can explain a little bit on that, please. I was interested in learn more about how, if TK has been removed from that, it means that sociocultural history of genes. Because what we're talking about is only the history about genes and the biological history of these materials. However, when they were subject to certain forms of intervention or manipulation, and some centers of origin also actually tried to make a stance on that, do you think that there's any chance that we can bring on the table anything related to these other complementary aspects of the biological history of genes?
Go ahead, Preston.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So on the issue of the beneficial, first of all, there are indigenous researchers actually doing DSI. So there are ways to do DSI in the right way, in the culturally appropriate way. Again, I will wait till tomorrow when we talk about biocultural labels and the schemes that others are developing that would provide information of right ways and wrong ways to do research. We also know there are tribes that are using digital sequence information for their own species management. So what they're often used in conservation is to discover subspecies, to see what the genetic structure of populations are, see where genetic diversity might be eroding. Again, there are plenty of issues. Some of the ways to address this, and this actually relates to Ronaldo's question, we tried to bring out what we called embodied TK. So I'll give you the example of terra preta soils. Some interesting work just came out. Terra preta soils, that's a Portuguese word meaning dark earth. They also call them suelos indios, indigenous soils. They're black earth, so they've known for a long time that they're related to indigenous people's occupation of the Amazon and also places in Southeast Asia. They're found in tropical countries. Now, the argument was these were accidental byproducts of their occupation, and there is now pretty definitive evidence that these were actively created by indigenous peoples. We also know that a lot of the biodiversity in Amazonia would not have been there, one, if there were not these terra preta soils, which increases the nutrient content of the soils and the structure of the soils, and if indigenous peoples hadn't been engaged in their traditional agriculture, which created a lot of diversity of habitat that otherwise would not have been there. So indigenous peoples have been shaping genomes. We know that. We tried to get that idea across. It was unsuccessful. And, you know, again, making another stab at it will be very, very difficult. And we would need a coordinated effort with lots of support. And we need to know who our state supporters would be. And again, I'm always open to those things, but you have to come up with the support. Where we did get the traction was from out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that talked about the custodianship or stewardship or guardianship that indigenous peoples and local communities are provided so that it exists. In other words, you know, we protect biodiversity, and then, you know, when it migrates, the other people get benefits out of it. Look at what they've done to their landscape. So anyway, this larger issue, it could be tackled. I don't see, we have, you know, where do we have the scope? What can we do really, we have to have it done by August, because those are the recommendations that will have the biggest influence on COP. We do have scope, again, in the benefit sharing mechanism and in the governance of the funds to direct activities towards these cultural activities. And again, we need to make it clear. They haven't really discussed this at all. This, again, one of those last details, that, you know, it's not just simply that indigenous peoples, local communities protect it, but they need support and protection for them to continue to protect it. So, for example, language revitalization, we've argued there needs to be funding for language revitalization because it's in indigenous peoples' local languages where the concepts and the norms and the values are expressed. We need to retain those. There's a lot of things that can be done to emphasize the cultural, spiritual, and other aspects. The problem comes if you start trying to push those into law. Well, guess what? We have a lot of other, actually at the moment, I live in a country where we have a major religion trying to push itself into government. And so there is you know, again, it becomes really hard for international public policy on how far we can go on, you know, spiritual issues being a determining factor. That doesn't mean they can't be taken into account. So again, if we want that story, we need to work on how we're going to get that story across in the remaining informal advisor group. And again, I'm hoping the biocultural protocols and labels discussion tomorrow will help on that. Did I miss anything else? Yeah, okay. So again, this is, so the rights to the DSI, as I see it, once it's turned into DSI, this is the whole point of the technical discussion. It becomes very difficult to get an ownership regime over the actual sequences. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. There is an ownership regime over the samples. Nagoya still stands, CBD still stands, and we have been from the very beginning very clear that you cannot put genetic resources obtained from indigenous peoples or local communities' lands into these databases without their consent. That's a bottom line. And again, on Kamal's, I'm reading Kamal's. Yes, of course, we will talk about that. There is scope for moral rights as well. Again, the legal issues are pretty difficult, but we do want to talk. We have talked about them. We continue to talk about them. We still will. So, for example, on these ancestral domains, we have said as part of your data governance in your collection is that you should be, indigenous peoples and local communities should participate when you're collecting from their ancestral lands. We have guidance, a little bit of guidance. It's not tailored for DSI. We have CBD guidance in the Aguagu guidelines. So we do, and we have other kinds of guidances in other documents, and we really should bring those out, and people should bring their references and their citations to our meetings so that we can work on kind of the moral aspects. And again, I'm not against the legal aspects, and some states, as we will hear, I hope from John tomorrow, have actually agreed there's a requirement for that kind of participation. And we can try to, we can push that, but we're not going to, it'll be hard to get consensus out of the parties on a binding, binding decision.
Ya. Bueno, muchas gracias, Preston, por esta excelente presentación. También a Tauco y a todos.
Thank you very much, Preston and Tauco, for your presentations. Our time is up, and we will continue tomorrow at the same time. We have a separate link for accessing tomorrow's meeting. Maybe we can now take a picture of our group. So please turn on your cameras, and so you can appear in the photo.
Ahí Olga o Agustina nos dicen, por favor.
Olga or Agustina, please let us know when you have taken the picture. And we're taking the second group of participants. I combed my hair this time. Very good, Yesenia.
Ramiro, tus palabras finales, Ramiro.
Would you like to say a few final words, Ramiro? Thanks to all of you for participating in this meeting. Thanks to Preston and Tauco of the Secretariat and everyone who contributed to this event. And I hope that all of you will be able to participate in the event tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you, brother.
Gracias, Raymond y Luz.
Gracias
Nos
a
vemos
todos.
mañana.
Gracias, Raymond. Gracias a todos. Gracias.
See you tomorrow.